Silas Vane did not wait for Eleanor to step down from the stagecoach. He grabbed her by the wrist. Not a handshake, not a greeting, a grip, the kind that left marks, yanking her down onto the dirt street of Dusthaven Ridge, like he was unloading a piece of furniture he'd ordered from a catalog. Eleanor gasped, nearly losing her footing, and the small travel bag she'd clutched across 2,000 miles of railroad and rough road tumbled from her fingers into the dust. "You're late," he said. He didn't look at her face when he said it. He looked her up and down the way a man inspects livestock at auction. Eleanor stood in the Montana afternoon with her heart hammering and her wrist already aching, and she understood, with the kind of cold, sudden clarity that doesn't leave a person, that she had made a terrible mistake. If this story makes you feel something, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has already traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Quote, Eleanor Whitmore had not always been a woman who made desperate decisions. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she had her own small routine, her own small life. A rented room above a tailor's shop on Merchant Street in Boston, a sewing basket by the window, a cup of tea gone cold because she'd been too busy finishing a hymn to drink it. She had been a seamstress for 11 years since she was 19, and she was good at it, better than good. She could read a woman's posture and know within 30 seconds what cut would flatter her and what would not, could take a bolt of cheap wool and produce something that looked like it came from a shop on Newbury Street. Her fingers knew thread the way a carpenter's hands know wood, by feel, without thinking. It had been enough. Not comfortable, not easy, but enough. Then the shop burned. It happened on a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that makes the city feel like a held breath. A lamp tipped somewhere in the back storage room, and by the time the fire brigade arrived, the whole building was gone. Eleanor stood on the frozen street in her coat and nightgown with 63 cents in her pocket, everything she'd grabbed in the 30 seconds she'd had to grab anything, and watched 11 years of her life turn to ash and black smoke. The tailor, Mr. Hennessy, was ruined. He paid Eleanor 2 weeks' wages from what he had left and told her he was sorry, and she believed that he was. But sorry didn't pay rent. Sorry didn't buy fabric. Sorry didn't put food on the table while she looked for new work in a city that already had more seamstresses than it needed. She found a room in a boarding house on the poorer end of Beacon Hill and spent 3 weeks walking from shop to shop with her references folded carefully in her coat pocket. One shop took her on part-time, barely enough to cover the room, nothing left for food most days. She started eating 1 meal instead of 2, then sometimes 1 meal every 2 days, and telling herself it was fine. It was temporary, something would come through. Nothing came through. By April, she was 3 weeks behind on rent, and the boarding house keeper, a wide woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had kind eyes but a firm sense of business, told Eleanor she had until the end of the month. It was Mrs. Pruitt's daughter, actually, who showed Eleanor the advertisement. The girl, 16, quick-eyed, with ink perpetually on her fingers from the novels she devoured, had been reading through the back pages of a newspaper and slid it across the kitchen table one evening without comment, the way a person sets down a match near something dry and pretends not to notice. Sought, a woman of good character and practical disposition, capable of managing a household and willing to relocate to the Montana Territory. The advertiser is a successful rancher of considerable means, seeking a wife of honest temperament. Correspondence invited. Arrangements will be made for travel. Reply to S. Vane, Dusthaven Ridge, Montana. Eleanor read it twice, folded the paper, read it again. She was not a fool. She knew what mail order arrangements were, knew the risks. Women who arrived to find their correspondence had been wildly optimistic. Men who turned out to be nothing like the letters suggested. She had heard the stories. Every woman in Boston had heard the stories. But she was also 30 years old, alone, out of options, and 2 weeks from living on the street. She wrote back. The exchange of letters took 6 weeks. Silas Vane wrote in a firm, clear hand, not the handwriting of an educated man exactly, but organized, deliberate. He described his ranch in detail. 1,200 acres in the Yellowstone River Valley, a good-sized herd, a proper house with glass windows, and a wood stove in every room. He described himself as a widower, no children, a man who worked hard and expected the same from those around him, but was fair in his dealings. He said he wanted a wife who was sensible and self-sufficient, not a woman looking for luxury, and Eleanor thought that was at least honest. He did not write with warmth. There were no flourishes, no attempt to charm her. Eleanor told herself that was actually a point in his favor. A man who wrote flowery letters to a woman he'd never met was a man performing. This felt more like someone trying to fill a practical need, same as she was. She replied that she was practical, that she was a skilled seamstress, that she was accustomed to hard work and did not expect comfort handed to her, that she would be a reliable partner in running a household. He sent money for the train ticket 3 days later. Eleanor packed what she owned into a single bag: 2 dresses, a wool coat, her sewing kit, a small mirror, the last photograph of her mother taken in 1878. She told Mrs. Pruitt she was leaving. The woman wished her luck in the cautious way people wish luck on something they're not sure is wise. The journey west took 9 days by rail, then another 2 by stagecoach into the Montana foothills, and by the time Dust Haven Ridge appeared through the coach window, a single main street, a handful of buildings, the mountains rising hard and cold to the north, Eleanor had talked herself into a kind of careful optimism. It was not a grand place, but it was real. She had made it. She could build something here. Then the door swung open, and Silas Vane grabbed her wrist. He was not what the letters had suggested, or rather, he was, in the way a photograph taken at a flattering angle suggests a face that looks different in motion. He was tall, broad through the chest, dressed in a suit that was too new and too well pressed for a working ranch, the kind of suit a man puts on when he wants to project wealth, rather than because he actually has somewhere formal to be. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples, and he had the face of a man who had spent decades getting what he wanted by making other people feel small. "You're late," he said, and pulled her toward the street. Eleanor yanked her arm back. It was instinct. She hadn't planned it, hadn't thought it through. Her body simply refused before her mind could stop it. Silas stopped. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite anger yet, but was anger's close cousin. The cold, measuring look of a man recalculating. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am not a piece of luggage." Around them, the street had gone quiet. Not silent. There were the sounds of Dust Haven Ridge going about its afternoon, horses, a hammer somewhere, a door opening and closing. But the people on the street had gone still. A man outside the general store stopped sweeping and did not start again. 2 women standing near the dry goods window turned slightly away. A boy sitting on a fence post looked at his feet. Nobody spoke. Silas studied her for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not warmth, but a kind of recalibration, a decision being made. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not involve the eyes. "You must be tired from the journey," he said. His voice changed too. Smoothed out, became something resembling cordial. "Forgive me. Come on then. The wagon's just there." Eleanor looked at the people on the street. She looked at the women who had turned away, the man who had stopped sweeping, the boy studying his feet, and she felt the first real pulse of fear. Not fear of Silas exactly, not yet, but the fear of understanding that she was standing in a place where something was already known, something nobody was going to tell her. She picked up her bag herself and followed him to the wagon. The ride to the Vane Ranch took 40 minutes, and Silas spent most of it talking. He talked about the land, about the size of the herd, about the men he employed. He used the word employed in the deliberate way people use words they want you to notice. He talked about the house, about what Eleanor's responsibilities would be. He talked the way a man talks when he wants to fill silence so completely that the other person can't ask questions. Eleanor let him talk and looked at the country rolling past. It was beautiful in the way that country is beautiful when it doesn't care about you one way or another. The grass going gold in the late afternoon, the mountains sitting on the horizon with complete indifference to anything happening beneath them. Beautiful and remote and enormous. When they arrived at the ranch, 2 men were working near the barn. They stopped when the wagon came into the yard. They looked at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't unfriendly exactly, but it was guarded, watchful, the expression of people who have learned to be careful. "This is where you'll be living," Silas said. He was not asking her what she thought of it. He said it the way you tell someone a fact. The house was large by frontier standards. She could see that. 2 stories, proper wood construction, a wide porch. Inside, when he showed her through, there was furniture that had cost money. A real dining table, a rug that had come from somewhere east, a cast iron stove that was newer than anything she'd had in Boston. And yet something about all of it felt wrong in a way Eleanor couldn't immediately name. The house had the feel of a stage set. Things placed where things are supposed to be, but without any sense that someone actually lived there, actually chose any of it. There were no personal items, no photographs, no worn spots on the chairs, no evidence of a previous wife, which he had claimed to have had. "Where did you say your first wife passed?" Eleanor asked. Silas was standing in the doorway. He looked at her. "I didn't," he said. He showed her to a room that locked from the outside. Eleanor stood in the middle of that room after he'd left, listening to the sound of her own breathing, and did the kind of thinking she should have done 9 days ago on the train, but hadn't let herself do because she'd needed to believe in something. The room locked from the outside. The people on the street had looked away. There was no evidence of a previous wife. The letters had been organized and deliberate and told her almost nothing real about who he was. And he had grabbed her wrist before she'd even had a chance to speak. She tried the window. It opened, but they were on the 2nd floor, and below was a hard-packed yard with one of the ranch hands sitting on a barrel doing absolutely nothing, looking at nothing in particular, positioned with the specific aimlessness of a man who had been told to be there. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap to stop them from shaking. "Think," she told herself, "think." She had arrived on a Wednesday. The stagecoach had brought her in the afternoon. It was now evening, nearly dark. She had no money. She'd spent the last of her own on necessities for the journey, and the train ticket had been Silas's. She did not know this town. She did not know this territory. She did not know a single person within 2,000 miles who knew her name. She heard Silas moving through the house below. The weight of him, the unhurried confidence of someone moving through space they completely owned. She heard him speaking to someone, low and brief, and then boots on the porch steps and the creak of the outside door. When it was quiet enough, she moved to the door of the room and tried the handle. It turned. She stood very still, one hand on the handle, processing this. Either he'd forgotten or he'd decided a lock wasn't necessary, that he had enough other mechanisms in place that a locked room was redundant. That second thought was worse than the first. She pulled the door open slowly and stood in the dark hallway, listening. Downstairs, a lamp still burned. She could see the edge of its light at the bottom of the stairs. She moved to the top of the stairs and looked down. The front room was empty. From somewhere toward the back of the house, she could hear the sound of a man eating, the clink of metal on ceramic, unhurried. She stood there for a full minute, measuring. Then she heard him push back his chair. She retreated to the room, closed the door quietly, and sat back down on the bed. She needed to know what she was dealing with. She needed information, and she did not have any. She knew what she'd seen on the street, the averted eyes, the stillness, and she knew what she'd felt in the grip of his hand, and in the click of the window latch, and in the careful blankness of his letters. But knowing that something was wrong, and knowing what exactly was wrong, were different problems. She needed someone who would talk to her, and she didn't know if such a person existed in Dust Haven Ridge. In the morning, she decided, she would try to find out. But the morning did not go the way Eleanor planned. She was dressed before sunrise, had folded her things back into her bag out of some instinct she couldn't fully name, the instinct that says, keep yourself ready, and was sitting on the edge of the bed when she heard boots on the stairs, heavier than the night before, quicker. Silas came through the door without knocking. He was already dressed, already put together, the suit again. Not yesterday's suit, a different one, equally new-pressed. He carried something in his hand, a folder of papers. "Good," he said, seeing her dressed. "We're going to town." "To town?" Eleanor stood. "What for?" "There are papers to sign." He said it as though she'd asked a stupid question. "At the courthouse. Judge Aldridge keeps early hours." Eleanor looked at the folder in his hand. "What papers?" "Marriage papers." He said it flatly, and he was already moving toward the door, already assuming she would follow. This has taken long enough. You're here. You're of age. We agreed. We corresponded, Eleanor said. We did not agree to sign anything at sunrise on my first morning here. He stopped. He turned around slowly. The smile from the previous afternoon was gone. Whatever had been underneath it, the recalibration, the calculation, was more visible now in the early light, in the privacy of a room with no street witnesses. You came here to get married, he said. I paid for your journey here. That's the arrangement. I came here, Eleanor said carefully, to meet you and discuss an arrangement. I did not agree to sign legal documents on demand. He studied her. She made herself hold his gaze because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the moment she looked away would be the moment she lost something she would not get back. You don't have anywhere else to go, he said. It was not said cruelly. It was said as a simple, practical observation, as a fact. You don't have money. You don't know anyone here. You can't exactly walk back to Boston. No, Eleanor agreed. I can't. She let that sit. Let him think she was conceding. So we'll go to town, he said, and turned back to the door. I need to eat something first, Eleanor said. He stopped again. I haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, she said. I'm not going to be able to walk to the courthouse and back without eating something. Surely that's reasonable. Another pause. Then he jerked his head toward the stairs. 10 minutes. But breakfast was bread and coffee, eaten standing in the kitchen while Silas waited in the front room with his folder of papers. One of the ranch hands came in for water, looked at Eleanor, looked at the folder visible through the doorway, and looked away so fast it was almost like a flinch. Eleanor kept her face still and ate her bread and thought very fast. She could not refuse to go to the courthouse. She had no leverage, no allies, no means of forcing him to do anything. But she did not have to sign. A person could not be made to sign a legal document. Could they? She thought about Judge Aldridge keeping early hours, a judge who operated at the convenience of Silas Vane, a judge who would be waiting at the courthouse before the rest of the town was awake. She put down her coffee cup. I'm ready, she said. The road into town was the same 40-minute ride as the previous afternoon, but everything felt different in the thin early morning. The lights still gray-blue, the shadows long, the mountains a presence rather than a view. Eleanor sat on the wagon seat beside Silas and tried to look like a woman who had accepted the situation while she examined every inch of what she was looking at. The town. She needed the town. She needed to understand it, where things were, who the people were, whether there was anyone who might help her or whether she was entirely on her own. Yesterday she'd seen people look away. That didn't mean they all would. It couldn't mean that. She thought about the women near the dry goods window who had turned slightly away when Silas yanked her down from the stagecoach. The turning away itself, that was something. People who have no feeling don't turn away. They only turn away if they have feeling and are choosing not to act on it. And people who choose not to act on something can sometimes be helped to choose differently. She needed time. She needed to delay whatever Silas was planning just long enough to find a crack somewhere. The wagon rolled into Dusthaven Ridge as the sun was just clearing the eastern hills, painting everything amber and long-shadowed. The main street was mostly empty still. A few horses tied at rails, a man carrying supplies from a cart into a building. The courthouse sat at the far end of the street, a plain wood-frame building with a flag hanging still in the windless morning. Silas brought the wagon to a halt outside it and climbed down without a word. Eleanor climbed down on her own. She looked down the street, 3 blocks of Dusthaven Ridge, still half asleep, and she tried to read it the way she used to read a bolt of fabric, looking for the texture of it, the nature of it, what it might yield if you knew how to work with it. And that was when she saw the man sitting in a chair outside the barber shop. He was maybe 35, or perhaps older, with the kind of face the outdoors ages in particular ways, weathered around the eyes, lean in the jaw, brown from long days in the sun. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup, and he was watching the courthouse with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, but which might have been, something other than indifference. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at Eleanor. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second before Silas's hand closed around her upper arm. Not her wrist this time, her arm, higher up. the grip of someone who'd learned from the previous day's slip, and steered her toward the courthouse steps. Inside the courthouse was a single large room with a wooden railing dividing it, a raised desk at the far end where Judge Aldridge was already seated. He was a thin man in his 60s with the collapsed look of someone who had been making small negotiations with his conscience for so long that the negotiations had become the man. He looked up when they entered. He looked at Eleanor in much the same way the town had looked at her yesterday, except something more. A brief, rapid thing that might have been guilt, or might have been the careful blankness of a man who had learned not to feel it. "Mr. Vane," he said. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said clearly before Silas could speak. "Eleanor Whitmore, of Boston, Massachusetts." Aldridge looked at her, then at Silas. "Yes, well," he shuffled papers on his desk. "I understand we're here to formalize I would like to know the legal requirements," Eleanor said. She was still speaking clearly, projecting into the room, making sure her voice carried. "For a marriage contract to be valid in this territory, what does the law require?" Aldridge stopped shuffling. He looked at her more carefully now. Silas's grip on her arm tightened. "She's asking out of curiosity," he said, in the smooth, level voice of a man suppressing something. "She's not from the territory." "I'm asking," Eleanor said, "because I intend to understand what I'm signing before I sign it. Is that not the right of any party to a legal document?" A silence. Aldridge opened his mouth. The courthouse door opened behind them. Eleanor turned. The man from the barber shop stood in the doorway. He still had his coffee cup. His expression had not changed. It was still that thing she couldn't quite name. But he was here. He had come. And behind him, visible through the open door, she could see that the main street of Dusthaven Ridge was no longer empty. Caleb Mercer's ranch was 3 miles outside of Dusthaven Ridge, and Eleanor did not wait until the next day to go there. Mabel tried to talk her out of it. Not hard, not the way someone tries to talk you out of something they genuinely believe is wrong, but in the tentative way of a person who respects another person's judgment while also thinking the timing could be better. "At least eat something first," she said, and Eleanor ate, quickly, standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt too much like stopping. She borrowed Mabel's older mare, a brown horse named Clover who had strong opinions about her pace, and pursued them without apology, and followed the road north out of town with the afternoon sun dropping toward the western ridge line and the mountains throwing long shadows across the valley. She had been thinking continuously since the courthouse, in the particular way she used to think when she had a difficult commission, a complicated cut, an unusual fabric, something that required holding the whole shape in her mind while working one seam at a time. She was doing that now with Silas Vane, holding the whole shape of him. He was a man who operated through legal structure. The advertisements were filed. The correspondence was deliberate and documented on his end. The marriage papers were prepared in advance. He thought in terms of paperwork the way a general thinks in terms of territory. Every document was ground he occupied. Every signature was a position held. The women he targeted had no paperwork of their own. They arrived with their belongings in a bag, and their references folded in a coat pocket, and nothing that constituted legal standing in this territory. That was the architecture of it. She could see it clearly now, the same way she could see the architecture of a badly constructed garment. The seams that pulled, the places where the fabric was asked to do something it couldn't do without the right support. What she needed was her own paperwork, her own ground. She found Caleb at the fence line of his north pasture, working on a section of post that had rotted through at the base. He was in his work clothes now. The suit he must have put on for the courthouse visit was gone, replaced by canvas trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had a post hole digger and the expression of a man having a private argument with the ground. He heard the horse and looked up. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Mabel told you," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "She sent her boy around with a note about an hour ago," he said. He set the post hole digger against the fence and took off his hat and pressed the back of his wrist to his forehead. "I figured you'd come today. You seem like someone who doesn't let things sit." "I can't afford to let things sit," Eleanor said. She dismounted, which took some negotiation with Clover, and stood in the grass at the edge of his fence line. She said, "You've been collecting records, documents that Silas filed, marriage certificates, property records, anything connected to the women he brought here." "I have," Caleb said. He was watching her steadily. "What do you know about reading legal documents?" "I know how to read," Eleanor said, "and I kept accounts for Mr. Hennessy, the tailor I worked for in Boston, for the last 4 years. Invoices, contracts, supplier agreements. I know what a legal document looks like, and I know what to look for when something doesn't add up." She paused. "What do you have?" He looked at her for a moment longer, the way he had in the courthouse, that direct assessing look that was not unfriendly but was not naive either. "Come inside," he said. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected, a single-story structure that had been added onto in pieces over time, the additions visible in the slight variations in the lumber and the way the roofline changed angle twice. Inside it was clean in the way a man's house is clean when the man is particular about certain things and entirely unbothered about others. The floor was swept, the dishes were stacked, but there were papers on every flat surface, not scattered. Organized, actually, in a way that told Eleanor these were being actively maintained rather than accumulated by accident. The kitchen table had been commandeered as a work surface, and the papers were sorted into groups weighted down by river stones and a coffee mug and one boot that had apparently been the most convenient object at hand. "You really have been collecting these," Eleanor said. 2 years, Caleb said. He moved to the table and began pointing to the groups. "These are property filings. Silas has been acquiring land around the valley in pieces, some of it purchased outright, some of it through debt collection, some of it through arrangements I don't entirely understand. This stack here is the marriage records and the associated correspondence that Aldridge kept copies of. I got those from Aldridge's clerk, a young man named Foster who does not like his employer and was willing to be helpful for reasons of his own." He paused. "This one," he touched a smaller stack, set apart from the others, "is what I've been able to piece together about Ruth." Eleanor moved to that stack. "May I?" she asked. "That's why you're here," he said. She went through it slowly. Caleb put coffee on and didn't talk, which she appreciated. The documents were a combination of official records: the marriage certificate, a deed transfer that had happened 3 weeks after the marriage, a bill of sale for cattle, and Caleb's own notes, written in a hand that was careful and clearly the work of a man who wrote slowly and meant everything he put down. Ruth had been from Columbus, Ohio. She had arrived in Dusthaven Ridge in March of 1882 and married Silas Vane 11 days later. 7 weeks after the marriage, a property deed was amended to include her name, which sounded like generosity, until Eleanor noticed that the amendment was structured in a way that actually transferred her legal claim to the property from herself to Silas in the event of her death or abandonment of the marriage. She read it twice to make sure she understood it. "Did you see this?" she asked, and put her finger on the relevant clause. Caleb came to look over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. "I saw it," he said. "I didn't understand what it meant." "It means he married them for the property transfer," Eleanor said. "Or partly. He brings a woman out here. He marries her. He adds her name to a deed and structures the language so that if she leaves, if she abandons the marriage, everything transfers to him automatically. No legal dispute, no court proceedings. If she leaves, he wins." She looked up at Caleb. He was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes in detail, the ones that came from squinting in sun rather than from age. "If Ruth left," Eleanor said quietly, "he got something from that too." "Land," Caleb said. Her name was on a section of the east pasture. It's the section that connects his property to the river access. Without it, his land is landlocked from the river on that side. With it, he stopped. With it, he controls water access for every ranch in the Eastern Valley, Eleanor finished. They looked at each other. "He planned this," she said. "Not just the women. The whole sequence of it was planned. He's not just trapping women because he's a cruel man who enjoys it. He's doing it because each one adds something: land, water rights, legal standing." She set the paper down. "How many of the ranchers in the Eastern Valley buy water rights from him now?" Caleb turned back to his own stack and pulled out a separate paper. 3, he said, including Pete Hadlow, who has the largest spread after Silas. Hadlow pays Silas for river access every year, has for the past 18 months, since Ruth disappeared. And Hadlow doesn't know where that access came from, Eleanor said. Hadlow knows not to ask questions, Caleb said, with the tone of a man who is not judging this but is also not pretending it's anything other than what it is. Eleanor sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, not because she was tired, but because she needed to think without her body in the way. The pattern was clearer now, and clearer was worse. Silas Vane wasn't just cruel, he was building something. A systematic consolidation of land and water and legal standing in this valley, and the mechanism for building it was women who arrived alone and had their names attached to property, and then disappeared or were driven away under conditions that handed him everything they'd briefly been given. It was a machine. A patient, methodical machine. He would have done the same thing to me, Eleanor said. Yes, Caleb said. He did not dress it up. What stopped him with Clara? The woman before Ruth. He didn't marry Clara, did he? He just destroyed her reputation and drove her out. Why the different approach? Caleb went back to the papers. He found what he was looking for and handed it to her. Clara had a brother back east who was already suspicious. When Silas looked into it, and he looks into things before he moves, he found out the brother was the type who would come here and make noise. So he didn't go through with the marriage, just made sure she couldn't stay. He does his research first, Eleanor said. He does his research first, Caleb confirmed. Then he researched me, she said. He knew about the shop burning. He knew I had no family left, no employer to go back to. He knew I answered the advertisement because I had no other options. She pressed her lips together. He chose me on purpose. The coffee was done, and Caleb poured 2 cups and put one in front of her and sat down across the table. He held his own cup but didn't drink from it. He seemed to be working through something. I need to tell you something, he said, about why I stayed silent for 2 years. You don't have to, but I do, he said. He said it simply, without drama. I stayed silent because I owe Silas money. Or I did. I've paid most of it back now. I'm nearly clear. When I first came out here, I borrowed from him to get the ranch started. He loaned it because he wanted me in his pocket, and it worked for a while. Whenever I thought about going to Harlow or going to the county seat and talking to someone above Aldridge, I thought about that debt, and I told myself it wasn't the right time yet. He looked at her. That's the truth of it. Not just that I was afraid, that I had something to lose, and I chose my own interest. Eleanor looked at him across the table. She believed him, which made it complicated in the way truth usually is. How much do you still owe? She asked. $40, he said. Can you get $40? I've got 32 in the house. I could get the rest from Hendricks at the feed store. He owes me for 3 days of fence work last month. Pay off the debt, Eleanor said, before anything else, before we do anything else, because the moment he hears we've been looking through these papers, the first thing he'll do is call in your loan and use it to discredit anything you say. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who has just been told something he already knew but had not yet formed into a plan. You think fast, he said. I spent a week on a train convincing myself this was going to be fine, Eleanor said. I'm compensating. He almost smiled. Not quite. What else? He asked. I need to understand the legal system above Aldridge, Eleanor said. Who is Aldridge accountable to? Who appointed him? Is there a territorial court above the county level? There's a circuit judge who comes through twice a year, Caleb said. Judge Crane. He's due in Dusthaven Ridge in about 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Eleanor said. She ran the numbers in her head. Is Crane independent of Silas? As far as I know. He's territorial. He doesn't have local business interests. He doesn't have to worry about Silas's trade. Then 6 weeks is the timeline, Eleanor said. We need to document everything well enough that when Crane arrives, there's something for him to actually look at. Not suspicion, not rumor. Paper. Specific documents, specific dates, the deed transfer language, the property records. What happened to Ruth? As much of that as we can establish. She paused. And we need to do it without Silas knowing what we're building until it's too late for him to dismantle it. The afternoon light was shifting through the window. Caleb was looking at his papers, and Eleanor was looking at the list she was making in her head. And outside the ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of late afternoon, the animals settling, the wind picking up slightly from the north. There's something else, Caleb said. He said it in a different tone, lower, more careful. I should tell you now rather than later. Eleanor looked up. Silas has a man in town, he said. Not one of his ranch hands, someone local, someone who tells him what people are saying and what people are doing. I don't know who it is. I've never been able to figure it out, but I know he exists because there have been 3 times I've tried to have a private conversation in town, and Silas has known about it within a day. He met her eyes. This conversation, right now. If his man sees your horse outside my place and mentions it, Silas will know about it by nightfall. Eleanor absorbed this. Then he's going to know we've spoken, she said. He's going to know you came here, Caleb said. He's going to know we spent time together. He's going to assume we talked about him. Which means he's going to move faster, Eleanor said. The patient approach just got shortened. Probably, Caleb said. Eleanor stood up. She picked up her coffee and finished the last swallow, which had gone cold. She set the cup down and looked at the table full of papers. 2 years of careful, guilty, insufficient collection by a man who hadn't known what to do with it. I'm going to need to look through all of this, she said, properly. Tonight, if possible. Tonight is possible, Caleb said. I'll need to tell Mabel where I am, Eleanor said, and I'll need... She stopped. She was about to say she needed paper and a pen to take notes, and then she thought about Silas's man in town, and about what might happen if she was found with handwritten notes about Silas Vane's property records, and she changed the sentence. I'll need to memorize what I find. Write nothing down that I carry out of here. Caleb looked at her for a moment. You can do that? He asked. Memorize it? I used to keep the shop accounts in my head between Mondays, Eleanor said. Mr. Hennessy couldn't afford a good record book for the first 3 years. I did the numbers in my head every week and wrote them down on his ledger page each Monday morning. She paused. I haven't forgotten how. He nodded slowly. She could not tell if he was impressed or simply reassessing what he was dealing with. Possibly both. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Mr. Mercer, she said, what's your best guess about what Silas is doing right now, this afternoon, while we're here? Caleb thought about it. He took it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't give her a quick answer meant to sound reassuring. Visiting his friends, he said finally, reminding Aldridge of what's owed, probably talking to Harlow, maybe putting it around town that you left his place in a confused state, that you were difficult, that he's worried about you. He paused. And probably having a conversation with whoever his man is about who you've talked to since this morning. So by tomorrow, Eleanor said, the story in town will be that I'm unstable and he's the reasonable party. Something like that, Caleb said. He's had practice. Eleanor stood at the door of a small ranch house 3 miles from a town where she knew almost nobody, with no money and no legal standing, and a man actively working to make sure she stayed in both of those conditions. She thought about the courthouse that morning, about the moment she had picked up her bag and said, I am not signing anything today. She had done it without knowing what came next, which was perhaps the only reason she'd managed to do it at all. All right, she said, let me get a note to Mabel and come back. We've got work to do before it gets dark. She went out to where Clover was tied and stood for a moment in the yard with the late sun on her face and the mountains going purple at their peaks in the distance, and she let herself feel for exactly 15 seconds how frightened she was. Not because she needed to, but because she had learned that fear pushed down without acknowledgement had a way of coming up sideways when you could least afford it. 15 seconds. Then she untied Clover's reins and swung up into the saddle, with more difficulty than she'd have liked, because Clover had opinions about that too, and turned back toward the road. Behind her, through the ranch house window, she could see Caleb's silhouette moving back to the table, back to the papers. Whatever Silas Vane was doing on the other end of Dusthaven Ridge that afternoon, he was doing it under the assumption that Eleanor Whitmore was a woman who had been shaken loose from one bad situation and had nowhere to land. He was doing it under the assumption that she was, at this moment, trying to figure out how to survive. He was not entirely wrong about that, but he had made the same mistake he always made. The crack that Mabel had named that morning, the one that ran through everything he built. He had not asked what she was capable of. He had looked at what she didn't have and decided that was the whole picture. It wasn't. She was back at Caleb's ranch before the last of the daylight left the sky. and they worked through the papers until the lamp oil burned low, and Eleanor's eyes ached from reading in poor light. She did not write anything down. She read each document twice, sometimes 3 times, building the structure of it in her mind the way she used to build a pattern, each piece in relation to the others, the whole shape emerging from the parts. Caleb watched her work and refilled the coffee and answered questions when she had them, and otherwise stayed out of her way, which was exactly what she needed. By the time she rode back to Mabel's in the dark, she had the architecture of Silas Vane's operation mapped in her head with enough detail to be dangerous. 3 women, possibly a 4th, before Clara, who Caleb had only heard about secondhand from the laundry woman and couldn't document. Each one brought in through the same mechanism: advertisement, correspondence, passage, paid. Each one targeted for specific reasons. No family, no resources, no one who would make sustained noise about a disappearance. The marriages, the ones he actually went through with, each produced a property transfer within weeks, structured so that departure or death handed the land or water rights to Silas without legal contest. He had accumulated, through this method, river access on the eastern side, a section of high ground that controlled the only reliable road through the North Pass, and water table rights on the western edge of the valley that 3 smaller ranches depended on. It was not just cruelty. It was a land acquisition strategy using marriage as the instrument. The problem? The problem Eleanor had been circling all evening was that none of it was strictly illegal. Not the advertisements, not the marriages, not even the property transfer language, which had been drawn up by Aldridge and was, as far as she could tell, technically valid under territorial law. Ruth's disappearance was the only piece that could be characterized as something worse than predatory but not criminal, and Ruth was gone and no one had documented the circumstances of her leaving. Silas had built his machine inside the law. That was the whole point. She needed to find the place where he'd stepped outside it. The next morning arrived gray, with the smell of rain coming from the mountains, and Eleanor was at Mabel's kitchen table before the older woman was up, drinking yesterday's reheated coffee and thinking. Mabel came downstairs in her housecoat and looked at Eleanor and then at the state of the kitchen, which was exactly as she'd left it, and at Eleanor's eyes, which showed evidence of a short night. "You slept," Mabel said. "A little," Eleanor said, which was true only if 4 hours counted. "Did you find something in those papers?" "I found the shape of it," Eleanor said. "What I don't have yet is the piece that's actually illegal. Everything he's done fits inside the law closely enough that a territorial judge looking at it cold would need something specific to act on." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I need the property transfer documents re-examined by someone who knows territorial land law better than I do. And I need to know if there's any record of what happened to Ruth after she left. If she left." Mabel sat down. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing how much to say. "There's a lawyer in Birch Falls," she said. "Town about 40 miles east. Name of Asa Gould. He's handled land disputes in this valley before. Not with Silas directly, but he knows the territory law. He's not Silas's man." She paused. "He's not cheap." "I don't have money," Eleanor said. "No," Mabel agreed. "But Caleb does. Or can get it." Eleanor looked at her. "I know you didn't ask," Mabel said, "but if you're going to build something against Silas, you're going to need money at some point. And the only person in range who both has some and has reasons to use it for this is Caleb Mercer." She picked up Eleanor's cup and went to the stove to refill it. "The question is whether he's actually ready to go all the way, or whether he's still only ready to feel bad about not going all the way. Those are different things." Eleanor thought about what Caleb had told her the day before, about the $40 and the 2 years of collected papers and the choice he'd made when Ruth disappeared. She thought about a man building a case for 2 years and then sitting on it. "He came into the courthouse," Eleanor said. "He did," Mabel said. "That's new." She brought the cup back and set it down. "He was in here last night after you left, you know," Mabel said. "Before you came back. He stopped in to ask if you'd returned safely. Stood at the door for about 30 seconds, said very little, and went home. I've known Caleb Mercer for 3 years, and I don't think he stopped in to ask after anyone before." She raised an eyebrow in a way that was not exactly pointed, but was in the vicinity of pointed. "Don't," Eleanor said. "I'm just noting," Mabel said serenely. Eleanor drank her coffee and said nothing. The story Silas had apparently put around town began to reach them that morning through the normal channels. The feed store boy who delivered Mabel's grain order mentioned that he'd heard something, and the woman who came in to pick up her altered dress mentioned that she'd heard something different, but in the same direction. And by the time Eleanor had finished a full morning of mending work in the front room of the boarding house she had assembled from these scattered references, the shape of what Silas was saying. He was not saying she was unstable, exactly. He was more careful than that. He was saying he was concerned about her, that she had arrived clearly in some distress from her difficult situation back east, that he'd tried to make her comfortable and she'd become confused about the nature of their arrangement, that he held no hard feelings, but he was worried about a woman alone in an unfamiliar territory in that state of mind. It was precise. It stopped just short of calling her anything, just short of any specific claim she could argue against directly. It made her the object of concern rather than opposition. It made anyone who helped her seem like they were enabling a confused, fragile woman rather than supporting a person with a legitimate grievance. She had underestimated how good he was at this. She was mending the third shirt when the door opened and a woman came in whom she hadn't seen before. Small, somewhere in her 50s, with the compact efficiency of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as she needs and not 1 inch more. She looked at Eleanor with a directness that was not unfriendly. "You're the Whitmore woman," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. She set down the shirt. "And you're Vera Dunham. I run the schoolhouse." She came in and sat down across from Eleanor without being invited, which Eleanor found she didn't mind. "I heard what Silas is saying about you. I also heard what you said in the courthouse yesterday from Foster, the clerk. He told me directly. I wanted to see for myself." Eleanor looked at her. "What did you want to see?" "Whether you're what Foster said," Vera said, "or whether you're what Silas says." "And what did Foster say?" "That you asked intelligent questions about the legal requirements for a valid marriage contract and refused to sign anything until you understood it." Vera looked at her steadily. "That doesn't sound like a confused woman." "No," Eleanor said, "it doesn't." Vera was quiet for a moment. She had the manner of someone running a rapid internal assessment. "Do you know what his previous wives did when they were in town?" Vera asked. "Ruth, the one before you. She tried to talk to people. She would stop women on the street and try to explain what was happening. She was clearly frightened, and she was—" Vera paused. "She was not effective. Because she was frightened, and it showed, and Silas had already set the story before she had a chance to." She looked at Eleanor with something that was almost clinical. "You don't seem frightened." "I am," Eleanor said. "I'm just not leading with it." Vera's expression shifted very slightly. A reassessment. "The school needs an assistant," Vera said. "I told Caleb Mercer this 2 days ago, when he asked me before you even arrived, which tells me he was watching the situation more carefully than he let on. 3 mornings a week, 7 to noon. I can pay $1.50 a week, which isn't much, but it's yours. No conditions." Eleanor looked at her. "You're not concerned about what Silas will say if you hire me?" "Silas doesn't run my school," Vera said flatly. "The territory does. He's tried to get on the school board twice and been refused twice because I wrote letters to the territorial education office that were quite detailed about why that would be inadvisable." She smoothed her skirt. "He doesn't like me. I've survived it." Eleanor thought for a moment. 3 mornings a week and $1.50. It was almost nothing, but almost nothing was different from nothing in ways that mattered. It gave her a reason to be in town, a place to be, a relationship with someone who was visibly not afraid of Silas. It gave her a public position. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Thank you. I'll take it." Vera stood up, which was apparently the end of the conversation. "Monday morning, 7 sharp. The children in this territory are not gentle with people who are late." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing. You should know that there's a man named Denny Pratt who works at the livery stable. He tells Silas things, has been for about 2 years. She said it without drama, the way she'd say the weather was likely to be cold. Just so you know who to be careful around. Then she was gone. Eleanor sat in the front room of Mabel's boarding house with a half-mended shirt in her lap and the information about Denny Pratt turning over in her mind. She thought about Caleb's warning. His man in town, I've never been able to figure it out, and the particular satisfaction of having that piece fall into place. She also thought about Caleb asking Vera about the school position before Eleanor had even arrived in Dusthaven Ridge. She pushed that thought aside. There was too much else to think about. She found Caleb at the feed store at noon, paying off his bill with Hendricks, which told her he'd gotten there before she had. She waited outside while the transaction finished, and he came out and stopped when he saw her. "Pratt," she said quietly. "At the livery." Something moved across his face. "You're sure?" "Vera Dunham told me." He absorbed this. "Vera is generally reliable about that kind of thing," he said. He looked at the livery stable, visible at the far end of the street, and then looked away deliberately. "You paid off Hendricks," Eleanor said. $40 is paid, he said. "I'm clear." "Good. We need to talk about Asa Gould and Birch Falls." He looked at her. "Not here," she said. "Walk with me." They walked north on the main street, which was the direction away from the livery, and Eleanor laid out what she'd concluded the night before, the shape of Silas's operation, the property transfer strategy, the legal problem that none of it was technically illegal, and the need for someone who knew territorial land law well enough to find the crack if there was one. Caleb walked and listened and didn't interrupt. She had noticed he did this. Let things finish before he responded. It was a quality she was coming to appreciate because she was surrounded by a great deal of noise in her own head, and she needed the people around her to be still. "Gould charges by the day," he said when she finished. "I don't know his rate exactly, but it won't be small." "I know," Eleanor said, "but without legal weight behind what we're building, the 6 weeks until Crane arrives don't matter. Crane can look at everything we have and say it's a private matter and ride on." She stopped walking. "Caleb, what we have right now is a story. A compelling story, but Silas has a competing story, and he's been telling it longer and to more people. We need more than a story." Caleb was quiet. He was looking at the mountains in the way he did sometimes, not vacantly, but like the distance helped him think. "I can get to Birch Falls and back in 3 days if I push," he said. 2 if the weather holds and I ride hard." "Can you be away from the ranch for 3 days?" "I've got a hired man. He can manage." He paused. "The papers, I can't take the originals. If anything happened to them on the road, make copies of the most important ones," Eleanor said. "Tonight. The deed transfer with the abandonment clause specifically, and Ruth's marriage certificate, and the property records showing the river access." She looked at him directly. "I'd come with you, but I think my being visibly absent from town would give Silas an opening. He's watching to see what I do. If I stay and establish myself, the school job, Mabel's, I'm harder to move." "The school job," Caleb said. "Vera offered it this morning." Something crossed his face. "Good," he said, and meant it. "You already knew about it," Eleanor said. "She told me you'd asked her about it before I arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw the stage coming in," he said. "I'd been watching for it for a week. Something about the timing of it. Silas had been too quiet for a month, and that usually meant he was preparing something. When I figured out he'd placed another advertisement, He stopped. "You asked Vera if she had work," Eleanor said. "I didn't know if it would matter," he said. "I didn't know who was coming, or if they'd need it, or if they'd even talk to me. I just thought it was worth knowing." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He was not comfortable being looked at directly, she had noticed. He held it, but it cost him something. "Thank you," she said. "For that." He moved on before the moment could settle. "I'll leave for Birch Falls tomorrow morning. Copies of the papers tonight." He glanced down the street, not toward the livery, but in that general direction. "What do we do about Pratt?" "Nothing yet," Eleanor said. "If we move on Pratt, Silas knows we've identified his source and he finds another one and we lose the advantage of knowing who it is. Right now, Pratt is more useful to us not knowing that we know." Caleb looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that slight recalibration, the same one she'd seen in the courthouse, when something she said turned out to be more considered than he'd anticipated. "You've thought about this a lot," he said. "I've been thinking about nothing else for 2 days," she said. "I don't have money or legal standing or any of the things that would make me safe here. What I have is the ability to think faster than he expects me to. I'm not going to waste it." He nodded. Then, "There's something else. About Pratt." He lowered his voice slightly, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. A man who had learned to be careful about being overheard. "Pratt was at the Vane Ranch the day Ruth disappeared. I know because I passed him on the road heading out there in the early morning, and that was the same day she was gone. I thought nothing of it at the time. He does odd work for Silas beyond the livery." Eleanor went very still. "You're telling me he may have been there," she said slowly. "Not just a source for Silas, but someone who was physically present when Ruth left." "Or when she didn't," Caleb said. They stood on the north end of the main street of Dusthaven Ridge, with the clouds coming in fast from the mountain peaks and the first smell of real rain in the air, and the weight of what hung between them was considerable. "If Ruth didn't leave voluntarily," Eleanor said carefully, "then this is not just a land fraud case, and Silas is not just a predatory man who operates inside the law." "No," Caleb said, "and Pratt knows something." "I think so," Caleb said. "I've thought so for 2 years, but thinking and being able to prove it are different." Eleanor looked down the street. In the distance she could see the livery stable, its wide doors open to the gray afternoon, and a figure moving in the shadow inside it that might have been Denny Pratt, or might have been anyone. "When you go to Birch Falls," Eleanor said, "ask Gould about the legal standard for investigating a disappearance. Not an accusation. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone of anything, just what a territorial court would need to see before it would take an inquiry seriously." "I'll ask him," Caleb said. The rain started 20 minutes later, a real mountain rain that came down with serious intent, and the people of Dusthaven Ridge went about their business in it without much comment, because this was a town that had learned not to let weather have an opinion. Eleanor went back to Mabel's and spent the afternoon finishing the mending pile and starting on a dress Mabel's neighbor had brought over, which required taking the whole thing apart and rebuilding the bodice, because whoever had made it originally had apparently been working from imagination rather than knowledge. It felt good to have fabric in her hands again, to have a problem with clear parameters, this seam, this tension, this allowance, in the middle of a situation where most of the problems had parameters she was still trying to establish. Just before supper, there was a knock at the boarding house door, and Mabel answered it, and Eleanor heard voices in the front hall. A male voice she didn't recognize, low and deliberate. She set down the dress and came to the doorway. The man standing in the front hall was not Silas, not Caleb, not anyone she'd seen before. He was perhaps 40, with the broad, weathered look of a man who worked large animals, and he held his hat in his hands with the self-conscious care of someone in an unfamiliar interior. "Ma'am," he said when he saw Eleanor, "are you Miss Whitmore?" "I am," she said. "My name is Pete Hadlow," he said. "I've got the spread east of the valley. I heard you'd come to town and I'd like—" He stopped, looked briefly at Mabel, seemed to make a decision. "I'd like to ask you something, if you don't mind. It's about the water access on my east boundary, and it's about Silas Vane." Eleanor looked at him. This was the man who paid Silas for river access, the access that had come through Ruth's property transfer. "Come in, Mr. Hadlow," she said. "Sit down." He came in and sat at Mabel's kitchen table and turned his hat in his hands, and told her, in the halting way of a man not accustomed to admitting he's been wrong about something, that he'd been paying Silas Vane for water rights for 18 months, and had only recently, very recently, in the last 2 weeks, begun to suspect that the legal basis for those rights might not be what Silas had claimed it was. "I had a surveyor through," Hadlow said. "Independent man, didn't know Silas. He looked at my eastern boundary and the river access, and he said the rights documentation Silas showed me didn't match the original land grant records from the territorial office." He looked at Eleanor. He said someone had altered the filing date on one of the documents. Eleanor sat across from him very quietly. "Do you still have those documents?" she said. The ones Silas showed you? Copies, Hadlow said. Silas kept the originals, but I made copies when I first signed the agreement because my father always said never sign anything you don't have a copy of. He paused. I heard you've been asking questions. I heard you've been looking at his property records. He looked at her directly for the first time. I want to know what you found. Eleanor looked back at him. Outside, the rain came down steady and serious on the roof of Mabel's boarding house, and inside the kitchen, Pete Hadlow sat with his hat in his hands, not knowing that what he'd just placed on the table, altered territorial filing documents, an independent surveyor's assessment, was the piece Eleanor had been unable to find in 2 days of looking. Silas Vane had stepped outside the law after all, and he'd done it on paper. Hadlow's copies were in his saddlebag. He had brought them without knowing he would need them, or maybe, Eleanor thought, watching him pull them out with the careful movements of a man who understood he was handling something significant. Maybe some part of him had known exactly why he was coming here tonight, and had prepared accordingly without letting himself think about it too directly. She spread the documents on Mabel's kitchen table under the lamp, and looked at them alongside the property records she had memorized from Caleb's collection, building the comparison in her head. Hadlow sat across from her and watched her face and did not speak, which told her he was a man accustomed to waiting on someone else's reading of a situation before he committed to a position. The altered filing date was visible once you knew to look for it. The ink on that particular line was slightly darker than the surrounding text, and the date, amended to show the water rights transfer predating Ruth's arrival in Montana by 3 months, had been written over an erasure. You could see the ghost of the original date underneath if you held the page at an angle to the lamp. 3 months before Ruth arrived. That meant Silas had filed for water rights before he had a wife to put on the deed, which meant the entire property transfer mechanism with Ruth was fabricated. He'd already claimed the water rights through the territorial filing. Ruth's name on the deed was either a redundancy or a cover story, something to point to if anyone questioned the original filing, which meant he'd falsified a territorial land document. That was a federal matter. Eleanor looked up from the papers. Mr. Hadlow, she said, your surveyor. Is he still in the area? He's in Birch Falls, Hadlow said, working a job through the end of the month. Birch Falls. Where Caleb was already going. His name, she said. Tom Reeves. Hadlow watched her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Eleanor said carefully, that you and I and Caleb Mercer may be able to do something with this that none of us could do alone. She looked at him directly. But I need to ask you something first, and I need you to answer me honestly, not the way you'd answer if you were trying to protect your interests or maintain a position with Silas. Actually, honestly, Hadlow's jaw tightened slightly. Ask. How long have you suspected the documents were altered? A pause. A real one. Not the pause of a man thinking. The pause of a man deciding. 6 weeks, he said. And you didn't do anything for 6 weeks, she said. I've got 400 head of cattle, he said. I've got 3 hired men and a banknote due in March, and a sister's family living on the north end of my property because her husband died last spring. Silas Vane controls my water access, and if I move against him and fail, I don't just lose the case, I lose the ranch. I lose all of it. He looked at the table. So no, I didn't do anything for 6 weeks. I sat on it, and I hated myself for sitting on it, and I kept looking for a reason to believe the surveyor was wrong. But you came here tonight, Eleanor said. I came here tonight, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Caleb and his $40 and his 2 years of paper and his choice to walk into the courthouse that first morning. She thought about the people on the street who had turned away when Silas grabbed her off the stagecoach. Fear did not make a person bad, exactly. It just made them smaller than they actually were, and kept them that way until something changed the calculation. All right, she said. Here's what I need from you. Can you get your copies to Birch Falls, to your surveyor, Tom Reeves, before Caleb Mercer arrives there? I want Reeves to have looked at everything before Caleb talks to the lawyer. I can send a writer tonight, Hadlow said. Do it quietly. Don't go through the livery. He looked at her sharply. The man at the livery, Eleanor said. Denny Pratt. He reports to Silas. Hadlow absorbed this. Something moved across his face. The specific expression of a man recalculating how much of what he'd thought was private had not been. "I've used that livery twice this week," he said. "Then Silas may already know you've been looking at the documents," Eleanor said, "which means we have less time than I'd like." She looked at Mabel, who had been sitting at the far end of the table through this whole exchange, making tea and saying nothing, but also missing nothing. "How fast can news travel between here and Birch Falls?" Eleanor asked. "Rider with good horse and a reason. 6 hours," Mabel said. "Stage next morning. Telegraph, if you know the man at the office." She paused. "Silas knows the man at the office." "Of course he does," Eleanor said. She stood up from the table and went to the window. The rain had slackened but not stopped, the street outside running with shallow rivers between the wheel ruts. There were a few lights still on in the buildings she could see. The saloon, the general store, a window above the hardware shop that she'd been told belonged to Foster, Aldridge's clerk, who had liked Eleanor's questions in the courthouse. She thought about what they had and what they needed. They had altered territorial documents that constituted fraud. They had Hadlow's independent surveyor who could testify to the alteration. They had 2 years of Caleb's collected property records showing the pattern of acquisitions. They had Aldridge's obvious discomfort, which was the discomfort of a man who had helped with something he knew was wrong. They had Denny Pratt at the livery, who was a risk, but also, potentially, a card that could be played if the moment was right. What they needed: a lawyer who could present this to Circuit Judge Crane in a form that would require him to act. And they needed that presentation to happen before Silas understood what was coming and had time to dismantle it. 6 weeks had just become considerably less. She turned back from the window. "Mr. Hadlow," she said, "when you pay Silas for water access, how do you pay? Cash, bank draft, or recorded note?" He blinked at the shift. "Recorded note," he said. "Filed at the courthouse." "Filed with Aldridge," she said. "Yes." She looked at Mabel again. "Foster," she said. "Aldridge's clerk. How much does he dislike his employer?" Mabel considered. "Enough to have told Vera Dunham what happened in the courthouse that morning within 2 hours of it happening," she said. "Enough to have given Caleb copies of Aldridge's correspondence files 2 years ago. Enough to make an unofficial copy of every water rights payment record filed in the last 2 years and leave it somewhere accessible?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. "That would be a significant step for a young man who needs his job," she said carefully. "I know," Eleanor said, "but those payment records combined with the altered filing date on the original claim would show that Silas has been collecting money for rights he obtained through a falsified document. That's not just land fraud. That's ongoing collection of payments under false pretense. That's a different category of charge entirely." She heard Hadlow exhale slowly across the table. "How do you know this?" he said. It wasn't a challenge exactly. It was the genuine question of a man trying to orient himself. "I kept accounts for 11 years, Eleanor said. "And I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 days. She sat back down at the table. "Here's what I think we need to do," she said, "and I'm going to say this clearly so we all understand what we're agreeing to. If we move on this, we move together. Not Caleb alone, not you alone, not me alone. Because the moment Silas identifies a single person as the threat, he focuses everything on that person, and he's very good at it. We've all seen what he does to individuals." She looked at Hadlow, then at Mabel. What he is not prepared for, what he has never had to deal with because he's always succeeded in keeping people isolated, is multiple people moving at once. Hadlow was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not doubt, not resistance. Something more like the recalibration she'd seen in Caleb when a thing turned out to be more than you expected. "You've been here 4 days, he said. 3.5, Eleanor said. "And you've already got more of this figured out than I've managed in 6 weeks. "You had other things weighing on you," she said. "I don't have a ranch to lose. I don't have anything to lose except the thing I'm already trying to get back, which is my own freedom to make decisions." She paused. "That's a different kind of motivation." Hadlow was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat on the table. Not to leave, but in the way a man puts something down when he's settling in. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. She sent Hadlow out the back way with instructions to get his rider to Birch Falls through the southern route that didn't pass the livery, and she sat at the table with Mabel after he was gone and finally let herself be still for a few minutes. "You should sleep," Mabel said. "You're running on nothing." "I know," Eleanor said. "I will." She looked at the lamp flame. "Mabel, when Ruth was here at Bob, did you know her? Did she come to you?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. "She came once," she said, "about 3 weeks after she arrived. She came to the door and she looked—" Mabel stopped, started again. "She looked the way a person looks when they've been frightened for a long time and they're trying not to show it. She asked if I had a room. I told her I had one, but Silas would make it impossible for her to stay if she took it. He'd already leaned on me once that year about something else, and I didn't think I could hold it twice." She put her hands flat on the table. "I told her I was sorry. She thanked me for being honest, and she left." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two women who understood something together without needing to say it. "She deserved better," Eleanor said. "Yes," Mabel said. "She did." "If we do this right," Eleanor said. "If Crane comes and there's enough to act on, there's a chance Ruth could come home, if she's still alive, if she knows there's something to come home to." "That's a lot of ifs," Mabel said. "I know," Eleanor said. "But it's more ifs than she had a week ago." She went to bed and slept harder than she expected to, the deep blank sleep of a body that has simply run out, and woke before dawn to the sound of a horse moving on the street outside, and lay in the dark sorting through everything she needed to hold in place today. Caleb was on the road to Birch Falls. Hadlow's rider was on the road to Birch Falls by a different route. Foster, Aldridge's clerk. She needed to talk to Foster today, carefully, somewhere that Pratt couldn't see. And she needed to spend her morning at Vera Dunham's school, acting as though none of the rest of it existed, because her visible presence in the normal life of Dusthaven Ridge was its own kind of protection. She got dressed and went downstairs and was halfway through making coffee when someone knocked at the back door. Not the front, the back. She went to the door and opened it and found a boy of about 12 standing in the early morning light with his cap in his hands and mud on his boots from the previous night's rain. "Miss Whitmore?" he said. "Yes." "I work for Mr. Hendricks at the feed store," he said. "He asked me to bring you this." He held out a folded paper. She took it. He left without waiting to see her read it, which told her Hendricks had sent him with specific instructions to do exactly that. The note was short and written in the careful, slightly labored hand of a man who could write but didn't do it constantly. "Miss Whitmore, I don't know what you're building, but I know you're building something, and I know it has to do with Silas. I have 2 years of grain receipts from the Vane Ranch that he's been underreporting on his property tax filings. Small difference each time adds up to something significant over 2 years. I don't know if it helps, but it's yours if you want it. Hendricks. Don't come to the store today. Send word through Mabel." Eleanor stood at the back door in the early morning with the note in her hand and felt something she hadn't felt since arriving in Montana. Not hope, exactly, because hope was too simple a word for what this was. It was more the specific feeling of watching a pattern become visible, the way a design emerges from what looked like random pieces. She had not recruited Hendricks. She had not sought him out or explained anything to him. He had watched what was happening, had made his own assessment, and had decided to add his own piece. Silas had spent years making sure no one in Dusthaven Ridge would stand together. He had used debt and dependency and careful social pressure to keep everyone looking at their own interests and not at each other. And it had worked for a long time because people under enough individual pressure stopped being able to see the collective. But Eleanor had been talking to people, not organizing them, not recruiting them, just talking to them honestly about what she knew and what she was trying to do. And something had shifted. The people in this town were not cowards. They were people who had been kept isolated and frightened and individually outmatched. That was different. She went upstairs and wrote 3 notes, one to Hendricks through Mabel, saying yes, one to Foster, worded carefully, asking if he might be free for a conversation at Vera Dunham's school during the lunch hour. A public place, a reason for Eleanor to be there, and well outside Pratt's line of sight from the livery. and one that she folded twice and addressed to Caleb Mercer, care of Asa Gould, Birch Falls, asking Mabel to find a way to get it there that didn't go through the telegraph office. The school morning was ordinary in the way that nothing ordinary had been for the past several days, and Eleanor found it unexpectedly steadying. The children were 9, 10, 11 years old, and they had the combination of complete self-absorption and raw curiosity specific to that age. They did not care about Silas Vane or territorial land records or falsified filing dates. They cared about arithmetic and whether the boy at the next desk was looking at their paper, and their problems were the right size for them, and Eleanor helped with those problems and let her mind rest for 3 hours in the specific way that practical work rests a mind that has been running too hard. Vera watched her work from the front of the room with an expression that was appraising and by the end of the morning, something closer to satisfied. "You're good with them," Vera said, when the children had gone out for their midday break. "I used to help with my neighbor's children in Boston," Eleanor said, "on the days she needed to work." She paused. "Foster is coming at noon." "I know," Vera said. "I invited him. He needs a reason to be here that isn't obviously you." Eleanor looked at her. "How much do you know about what I'm doing?" "Enough," Vera said. "Mabel talks to me. Caleb talked to me before you arrived." "Hadlow's wife." "Did you know Hadlow has a wife?" "She came to see me this morning. Apparently her husband came home last night in a different state of mind than he's been in for 6 weeks, and she wanted to know why." She looked at Eleanor calmly. "This town has been waiting for someone to give it a reason to move. That's all it was ever waiting for." Foster arrived at 12 minutes past noon, a young man in his mid-20s with ink-stained fingers and the slightly hunted expression of someone who has been doing something he's not proud of, in proximity to something he knows is wrong. He shook Eleanor's hand too firmly, the way nervous people do. "I've already made copies," he said, almost before he sat down, "of the water rights payment filings, 2 years of them." He reached inside his jacket and produced an envelope. "I've been sitting on these for 3 months. I didn't know what to do with them." Eleanor took the envelope. It was thick. "Did anyone see you make them?" she asked. "No," he said. "I come in early. Aldridge doesn't get in until 9. He looked at his hands. "He's not a bad man. I want you to know that. He made a choice a long time ago to do what Silas said, and he's been paying for it ever since, and now he can't get out without admitting what he did." "What did he do?" Eleanor asked. Foster was quiet. "Foster," Eleanor said, not unkindly, "I'm not trying to destroy Aldridge, but I need to know what I'm working with." He exhaled. "The original water rights claim," he said, "the one with the altered date. Aldridge filed it. He filed it knowing the date was wrong because Silas told him to, and Silas has something on Aldridge, something personal, from before Aldridge came to this territory." He looked up. "I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it was enough." Eleanor nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Here's what I want you to do. Nothing more right now. Don't touch anything at the office. Don't change anything. Don't let Aldridge see that you've done anything different. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "When Circuit Judge Crane arrives," Eleanor said, "I'm going to need you to be willing to testify to what you've told me, to confirm that you made these copies, that you witnessed the filing, and that you have concerns about the process. Can you do that?" A long pause. "If other people are standing up too," he said. "Other people are standing up too," she said. He nodded, once, and left. It was in the middle of that afternoon, when Eleanor was back at Mabel's working through Hadlow's copied documents again, that Silas Vane appeared. She heard his horse first. She had developed, in 3 days, an awareness of the sounds of the street that she hadn't had before. The particular alertness of someone who knows they're being watched. Then Mabel's voice at the front door, level and unwelcoming. Then boots on the porch. Then Silas's voice. "I'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore." Mabel said she would ask. She came to find Eleanor in the front room and looked at her with the expression of someone who is not giving advice but is giving information. "He's alone," she said quietly. "No hands with him. He drove himself." Eleanor thought for a moment. The documents were upstairs. She did not have anything incriminating within reach. "Send him in," she said. He looked different than he had at the courthouse, or perhaps she was seeing him differently. The suit was the same quality, the bearing the same, but something about the deliberateness of him was more visible now, the way a performance becomes visible when you know it's a performance. "Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Vane," she said. He took in the room, the sewing on the table, the settled quality of someone making herself at home, and something moved in his face that might have been calculation or might have been something more unpleasant than calculation. "I think we started badly," he said. He sat down without being asked. "I owe you an apology for the way I handled your arrival." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned, with him, that silence cost him something. "I want to offer you a different arrangement," he said. "You're clearly not someone who responds well to being hurried. I understand that now. The smooth voice, the careful phrasing, the performance of reasonableness. Take the time you need. Stay in town, get settled, get to know Dust Haven Ridge. And when you're ready to have a proper conversation about the future, I'm willing to have it." She looked at him. "That's generous," she said. "I'm a generous man," he said, and almost believed himself. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Ruth," she said, "your first wife. Where is she now?" The room went very still. Silas looked at her with eyes that did not change. That was the thing about him. The eyes stayed level and controlled even when everything underneath them was something else. "I told you," he said. "She left." "I know what you told me," Eleanor said. "I'm asking where she is." "I don't know," he said. "That's the nature of someone leaving." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I was just curious. Because you brought her here the same way you brought me. Same kind of advertisement, same kind of correspondence, same passage paid. And then she was gone." She held his gaze. "I wondered if you ever think about her." A pause. The first pause she'd seen from him that was not entirely controlled. "She made her choices," he said. "People do." He left 10 minutes later without the conversation having gone anywhere he could use, and Eleanor watched his wagon move back down the main street from Mabel's front window and felt the specific cold clarity of understanding that the clock had just started running in a way it hadn't been before. He had come here to assess her, to see what she knew and how she was positioned, and whether the offer of patience would buy him information or compliance. He'd left without either, which meant he knew she was building something and he was now trying to figure out how fast. The answer was, faster than he thought. She went upstairs and took out the note she'd been drafting for Caleb, the one Mabel was finding a way to send through a private rider rather than the telegraph, and added 3 lines at the bottom. "He came here today. He's beginning to worry. Ask Gould specifically about the timeline for filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office, whether it can be done before Crane arrives or requires his presence. We may need to move before 6 weeks. EWW." She folded it and went downstairs and handed it to Mabel. "Tonight," Mabel said. "I've got someone." Eleanor nodded. She went back to the window and looked at the main street of Dust Haven Ridge in the late afternoon light, at the people moving through it going about their ordinary business. Hendricks loading something at the feed store, a woman she didn't know yet crossing toward the dry goods, Foster's light coming on above the courthouse as the evening came in. A town that had been kept still by one man's careful, patient pressure. A town that was, piece by piece, starting to move. Silas would come again. She knew that. The patience would not last much longer now that he understood she wasn't going to be moved by waiting. The next approach would be harder, more direct, less dressed up in the language of reasonableness. She intended to be ready for it. But she also knew, with the cold clarity she'd been living inside for 4 days now, that ready was not the same as safe, and that the space between where they were and where they needed to be was still considerable, and that a man who had been building this machine for years was not going to watch it taken apart without doing everything in his power to stop it. Outside, the last of the evening light left the western sky, and Dust Haven Ridge settled into the blue dark of a Montana night, and Eleanor Whitmore stood at the window of a boarding house that was not hers and looked at a town she had not chosen and thought about a woman named Ruth who had stood somewhere in this same town and asked for help and not found enough of it. Not yet, Eleanor thought, but soon. Caleb came back from Birch Falls on the 4th day, not the third. Eleanor knew something had changed before he said a word. He tied his horse at Mabel's front rail and came up the porch steps with the particular stillness of a man carrying more than he'd left with. And when she opened the door and looked at his face, she understood that whatever Asa Gould had told him in Birch Falls, it was not simple. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat at Mabel's kitchen table and put his hat down and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. "Gould says we have enough," he said, "for the land fraud, the altered filing date, the payment records Foster copied, Hadlow's surveyor. Gould says that's a federal matter, and it doesn't need to wait for Crane. There's a territorial land office representative in Helena who has jurisdiction over falsified filings. Gould is writing the formal complaint now. It can be submitted directly ahead of Crane's visit." "That's the good news," Eleanor said, because his face said there was more. Tom Reeves, Hadlow's surveyor, he looked at all of it together. The property records, the acquisition pattern, the timing of the marriages. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said he'd seen something like it once before, in Wyoming. A man who used the same mechanism. He said in that case, when the territorial investigators finally went through the ranch records, the actual internal records, not the filed documents, they found evidence of what had happened to a woman who'd officially abandoned the marriage. The kitchen was very quiet. "He doesn't think Ruth left voluntarily," Eleanor said. "No," Caleb said. "He doesn't." Eleanor sat down across from him. She had known this was a possibility. Had known it since the night Caleb told her Pratt had been on the road to the Vane Ranch the morning Ruth disappeared. But knowing something as a possibility and hearing it said plainly were different experiences. "Gould," she said, "does he think there's enough to bring a criminal inquiry, not just the land fraud?" "He says the land fraud complaint, once filed in Helena, will trigger an investigation that includes access to Silas's ranch records. If there's anything there," Caleb stopped. "He says investigators will find it if it exists, but he can't promise what they'll find." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Ruth's face, which she had never seen, thinking about a woman she knew only through a marriage certificate and a property deed and a few sentences from people who had briefly known her. A woman who had come west the same way Eleanor had, for the same reasons, with the same hope, and had run into the same man. "Pratt," she said. Caleb nodded. "Gould said the same thing. If Pratt was there that morning, and if something happened, Pratt is either a witness or he's more than a witness. Either way, when the investigation starts, they'll want to talk to him." He looked at her. "The question is whether Silas gets to Pratt first and whether Pratt runs." "How long before the complaint reaches Helena from Birch Falls?" Eleanor asked. "Gould said a week, if he sends it by fast rider rather than post. Maybe 10 days before anyone in Helena begins to act on it." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Silas doesn't know the complaint is being filed, but he knows something is happening. You said he came here." 4 days ago, Eleanor said. "He'll come again. And if he gets word from Pratt that you went to Birch Falls and came back, he may already have that," Caleb said. They looked at each other across Mabel's kitchen table. "We need to move on Pratt today," Eleanor said. "Not confront him. I don't mean confront him, but he needs to understand what's coming and what his position is before Silas gets to him. Because right now Pratt thinks his best option is loyalty to Silas. We need him to understand that loyalty to Silas is the worst option he has." "That means telling him about the complaint," Caleb said, "before it's filed." "Yes," Eleanor said, "it's a risk. But the alternative is Silas controls the narrative with Pratt, and Pratt disappears before anyone can talk to him." She paused. "Who gets to Pratt?" "Not you. Silas knows you're involved. Not me. Pratt knows who I am." Caleb thought. "Hadlow," he said. "Pratt has done work for Hadlow before. Hadlow has a reason to visit the livery that has nothing to do with any of this. And Hadlow is—" He paused. "Hadlow is afraid, but he's in it now," Eleanor finished. "He made his choice when he came here 4 nights ago." "I'll go to Hadlow," Caleb said. He left within the hour. Eleanor went upstairs and tried to do something useful with her hands. The mending pile was smaller now. She'd worked through most of it, and found that she couldn't keep her mind on it. She put the sewing down and sat at the window and watched the street. She had been in Dusthaven Ridge for 8 days. 8 days since the stagecoach pulled in and Silas Vane grabbed her wrist before she'd had a chance to find her footing. 8 days since she'd stood on that street and looked at a town that had turned its back and thought, I am entirely alone in this. She was not alone now. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not because anyone had saved her. Nobody had saved her. She had done the work herself and she knew it. But because she had talked to people honestly and they had turned out to be capable of more than they'd been showing. That felt important in a way that went beyond her own situation. A town is not a collection of buildings or a set of businesses or a map of who owns what land. It's a set of choices that people make about each other, daily, small choices. To look or to look away. To speak or to stay quiet. To add your piece or to tell yourself your piece is too small to matter. Dusthaven Ridge had been making one set of choices for years, under pressure, under fear, under the patient weight of a man who understood that isolated people are manageable people. And now it was making different choices, one person at a time, each one making the next one a little easier. She thought about what it had cost them. Not just what Silas had done to the women he'd brought here, but what he'd done to this town, the slow erosion of it, the way people had learned to look away and told themselves that was just prudence, just survival, until the looking away became automatic and they stopped noticing they were doing it. That was what she was most angry about, she realized. More than what he'd done to her, more than the wrist and the locked room and the staged papers at the courthouse. What she was most angry about was what he had done to the people of this town over years. Had made them smaller than they were. Had made them afraid of each other's eyes. Had turned neighbors into strangers who didn't ask questions. Hadlow came to Mabel's door that evening with Caleb behind him and an expression on his face that was complicated in ways that would take a while to sort out. Pratt talked, Hadlow said. He sat down heavily. I went to the livery under the pretense of a loose shoe on my roan. I told him what was coming. The complaint to Helena, the investigation, what investigators would be looking for. He looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time and then he said, Does it matter, at this point, whether I tell someone what I know? Eleanor's breath went shallow. What does he know? She said. Hadlow looked at Caleb, then at Eleanor. Ruth didn't leave, he said. Not voluntarily. Silas told her she was getting a property transfer reversed, told her he'd realized the structure of the deed wasn't fair to her and he wanted to fix it. Took her out to the east pasture in the early morning to show her the boundary markers. Pratt drove the wagon. He stopped. He says he didn't know what Silas intended. He says he thought it was a genuine property discussion. He says when things went wrong, he was too scared to do anything, and then Silas told him what would happen to him if he ever opened his mouth. The room was very quiet. Where is she? Eleanor asked. Pratt doesn't know for certain, Hadlow said. He says he drove the wagon back alone. He didn't see... He wasn't present for... He stopped again. His jaw worked. He says there's a section of the eastern pasture near the old creek bed. He says Silas spent 2 hours out there alone that morning before he came back to the ranch. Nobody spoke for a moment. It was Caleb who spoke first, and his voice was very level in the way voices go level when the alternative is not level at all. Gould needs to know this today, he said. Not in a letter. Someone needs to ride to Birch Falls tonight and tell him in person so he can amend the complaint before it goes to Helena. This changes the category of what we're filing. I'll go, Hadlow said. My horse is faster than yours. Pratt, Eleanor said. Is he going to run? He said he wouldn't, Hadlow said. I don't know if that's worth anything. Tell him, Eleanor said carefully, that if he runs, he looks like a man with the worst possible reason to run. Tell him his best protection right now is to stay and tell the truth. Tell him that the people who cooperate with an investigation are treated differently than the people who don't. She paused. And tell him that Ruth deserves someone to say what happened to her, even if it's someone who waited too long and is ashamed of it. She looked at Hadlow. He understands being ashamed of waiting too long. Tell him that. Hadlow left for Birch Falls within the hour, pushing hard into the dark. Silas came the next morning. Not to Mabel's door this time. He came to the main street, and he came with 2 of his ranch hands, which was a different kind of visit than the careful, alone, reasonable visit of 4 days ago. He tied up outside the general store and went inside, and Eleanor heard about it from the feed store boy within 20 minutes. She did not go out. She sent a note to Vera Dunham and a note to Foster, and she sat at Mabel's front window and watched the main street and waited. Silas came out of the general store and stood on the boardwalk and looked down the street in the direction of Mabel's boarding house. He was too far away for Eleanor to read his expression, but she didn't need to read it. She could read it from here. It was the expression of a man who has run the numbers and doesn't like what they're telling him. Caleb arrived at Mabel's back door at noon. "He's been to Aldridge," Caleb said. Foster sent word. Silas wanted to know if any of the filed documents had been accessed or copied. Aldridge told him he didn't know. "Does Aldridge know?" Eleanor said. "He knows about Foster," Caleb said. "He's known for a while and hasn't said anything, which tells you something about where Aldridge is right now." He looked at her. "He's scared. But I don't think he's going to give Foster to Silas. I think he's finally more scared of what comes after than of Silas." "What changed?" Eleanor asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I went to see him yesterday morning, before I came here." He said it in the tone of someone reporting something they're not certain was the right decision. "I told him what was coming. I told him about the complaint to Helena and what it covered, and that the investigation would look at everything, including the people who had helped file falsified documents." He paused. "I told him there was a difference between a man who had made bad choices under pressure and fully cooperated with investigators, and a man who continued to obstruct even when the outcome was already decided." Eleanor looked at him. "You went to Aldridge alone?" "Yes." "That was a risk," she said. "He could have gone straight to Silas." "I know," Caleb said, "but I thought, he's not a bad man, like Foster said. He's a man who made a choice a long time ago and has been trapped by it since. Sometimes the thing that frees someone from a trap is making it clear the trap is already sprung." He looked at her directly. "Was I wrong?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." The week that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life, and also, in a strange way, the most clarifying. Gould's amended complaint reached Helena with Hadlow's account of what Pratt had told him attached as a sworn statement. The Territorial Land Office representative, a man named Briggs, who turned out to be thorough in the unhurried way of someone who has handled fraud cases before and knows that patience produces better evidence than haste, arrived in Dusthaven Ridge 12 days after Caleb returned from Birch Falls. He came quietly, without announcement, and his first stop was not the courthouse and not the Vane Ranch. It was Mabel Fitch's boarding house. He sat at the kitchen table where so many important conversations had happened in the past 2 weeks, and he listened to Eleanor lay out everything she had: the documents, the acquisition pattern, Hadlow's copies, the payment records Foster had made, the surveyor's assessment, Pratt's statement, and he asked precise, limited questions and took careful notes. And when she was done, he closed his notebook and said, "You've done most of my job for me." "I had help," Eleanor said. "I can see that," he said. "How many people?" She counted. Caleb, Mabel, Hadlow, Vera, Foster, Hendricks, and Pratt, in his own terrible, belated way. 7, she said. He nodded. He closed his notebook. "Give me 4 days," he said. On the second of those 4 days, Silas Vane was informed formally that his property records and ranch documents were subject to a territorial investigation and that he was required to remain available for questioning. One of his ranch hands, according to Hendrick's boy, who saw everything, rode out hard toward the North Pass Road and was stopped by a territorial deputy who had been positioned there for exactly that reason. On the third day, investigators went to the eastern pasture near the old creek bed on the Vane property. Eleanor did not let herself think too directly about that day. She went to the school and helped Vera's students with their arithmetic, and she kept her hands busy and her face still, and she did not think about what they might find until Caleb came to Mabel's door at dusk with an expression on his face that told her before he spoke. "They found her," he said. Eleanor sat down. She hadn't meant to sit. She was standing in the front hallway, and her legs made the decision without her. "She's buried on the property," Caleb said. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and his voice was very quiet. Near the creek bed, where Pratt said. Eleanor put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Then she didn't leave, Eleanor said. No, Caleb said. She didn't leave. They were both quiet for a long time. It was Mabel who finally moved, coming from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee she hadn't been asked to make, setting them down on the front hall table with the deliberate care of a woman who needs to do something with her hands when words aren't enough. She sat on the bottom stair and looked at neither of them in particular and said nothing, and somehow the 3 of them being in that small hallway together was more bearable than being in it alone would have been. Her family in Ohio, Eleanor said finally. Someone needs to write to them. Gould will handle the official notification, Caleb said. But, he stopped. I thought maybe you'd want to write to them too, from someone who was here. Eleanor looked at him. Yes, she said. I'll write to them. Silas Vane was arrested on the morning of the 4th day. Eleanor did not watch it happen. She heard about it afterward from Hendricks, who had watched from the feed store doorway with the expression of a man who had waited a long time for a particular morning and found that when it came, it was both satisfying and sad in ways he hadn't expected. Pratt was taken in for questioning and released with conditions. His full cooperation with the investigation in exchange for consideration on the lesser charges he faced. He left Dusthaven Ridge 2 weeks later. Eleanor did not know where he went, and she did not spend much time thinking about it. He had done a terrible thing by his silence, and he had done a necessary thing by finally breaking it, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she had enough experience with complicated truths to let them coexist. Aldridge resigned from his position before he could be formally removed. He filed a full written account of his involvement with the territorial office, not out of courage, Eleanor suspected, but out of the pragmatism of a man who understood the accounting had to be settled one way or another and chose the way that preserved something. The account was thorough, and it confirmed everything Eleanor and Caleb had already established, and added several details they hadn't known. Circuit Judge Crane arrived 5 weeks later, as scheduled, and presided over the beginning of formal proceedings against Silas Vane on charges of land document falsification, fraudulent collection of water rights payments, and the far graver charge that the investigators had established from the evidence at the creek bed. It would take months to work through the courts. These things always did. But Briggs told Eleanor before he left that the case was as well documented as any he had handled, and that he had no doubt about the outcome. You built this well, he said. We built it, she said. This whole town built it. He looked at her with the measured expression of a man who has seen a great many situations and knows what is ordinary and what is not. Not every town would have, he said. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The water rights reverted to the Territorial Land Office pending redistribution, which meant the 3 ranchers who had been paying Silas for access no longer owed anyone for it, a development that Pete Hadlow received with the particular silence of a man absorbing something he has wanted to believe was possible for a long time without quite letting himself. The section of eastern pasture where Ruth had been found was transferred to the territorial jurisdiction pending the resolution of the estate, which Silas had no descendants or legitimate heirs to contest. Dusthaven Ridge was a different town than it had been 6 weeks earlier, though not in the dramatic, clean-break way of a story that needs a tidy resolution. It was different in the way real places change, slowly, with backsliding, with people who were still afraid, and people who were newly brave, and people who were somewhere in between depending on the day. The man at the telegraph office was still the man at the telegraph office and would need to be lived with rather than replaced. The habits of looking away didn't vanish because the reason for them had been removed. Those things took time. Eleanor understood that. But the quality of the light in the main street felt different to her on the morning she walked to the school in the first week of November, 3 weeks after Silas's arrest, and she thought it was probably not the light itself, but something in the way people moved through it. A little less careful. A little more willing to make eye contact. She had a room at Mabel's that was hers, in the way a room becomes yours. Her sewing basket on the dresser, her coat on the hook behind the door, the window facing the kitchen garden that she'd learned to leave open even in the cold because she liked the smell of the frost on the remaining kale. She had the school job with Vera 3 mornings a week and enough mending and sewing work from the town to make up the rest of what she needed. She had money in a small tin on the dresser shelf. Not much, but real, and hers. She had not set out to build a life in Dust Haven Ridge. She had set out to survive it, which was a different intention entirely. But the life had accumulated around her in the process of surviving, in the way lives do when you're too busy fighting to be careful about what you're letting in. Caleb came to the boarding house on a Sunday in late November, which was unusual. He generally came in the week, with a purpose, and was uncomfortable about coming without one. He stood at the back door with his hat in his hands and looked at the kitchen garden and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking." "About what?" Eleanor said. "About whether I'm going to say this or keep not saying it," he said. He did not look at her when he said this, which she found she didn't mind. She had learned that directness with him sometimes required looking slightly away from the thing, the way you look at stars. I know the timing is not." He stopped. "You've been through something. I'm not trying to take advantage of that. I'm just tired of not saying it." "Say it," Eleanor said. He looked at her then. "I'd like to court you," he said. "Properly, if that's something you'd consider." Eleanor looked at him in the cold November light at Mabel's back door. The weathered face, the careful hands, the man who had spent 2 years collecting papers without knowing what to do with them and had walked into a courthouse one morning and decided to be someone different. He was not a simple man, and he was not a perfect one, and he had told her his failures as plainly as his intentions, which was the most honest thing she could say about anyone. "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went back down the garden path. Eleanor watched him go and felt something that was not the dramatic swell of feeling from stories, but something quieter and more durable. The particular warmth of knowing that the person walking away would come back, and that when they did, she would be glad. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about Boston, about the burned shop and the boarding house, and the advertisement in the back of a newspaper that a 16-year-old girl had slid across a table with ink on her fingers. She thought about the 9 days on the train telling herself it was going to be fine. She thought about stepping off the stagecoach and the grip on her wrist and the town full of people looking away. She had come west looking for safety. The ordinary kind. A roof, an income, a person to share the weight with. What she had found instead was something she had not known she was capable of, the discovery that she could be her own ground, that she could stand on herself when there was nothing else to stand on, and that standing on herself was enough to start building something real. That was not the lesson she had intended to learn. It was harder than the lesson she'd wanted, and it had cost more than she would have chosen to pay. But it was hers, in the way things are yours when you've earned them rather than been handed them, and she did not think she would forget it. The letter to Ruth's family in Columbus, Ohio, had taken her 3 nights to write. She had not known what to say. There was no version of it that was not devastating, no arrangement of words that made the thing bearable. In the end, she had said simply what was true, that Ruth had come to Montana with hope, that she had been wronged by someone who should have protected her, that the town had failed her and knew it, and that she was found, and she was not forgotten, and the man responsible would answer for it. She had signed it with her name and the address of Mabel's boarding house. The reply came 6 weeks later. It was from Ruth's sister, a woman named Helen, who wrote in a hand that shook slightly in some of the lines. She said she had been writing to the sheriff of Dust Haven Ridge for 2 years and hearing nothing, and that Eleanor's letter was the first honest word anyone had sent. She said Ruth had been 32 when she left for Montana. She said she had been a woman who laughed easily and was afraid of horses and made the best apple cake in Franklin County. Eleanor read that letter 3 times and then folded it and put it in the tin on the dresser shelf next to the money, where she would not lose it. Ruth had been a real person. She had laughed easily and been afraid of horses and made apple cake. She had answered an advertisement in a newspaper because she needed a way forward, and she had not found one, and the people around her had not helped her find one, and that was a true and terrible thing that would not be made untrue by anything that happened after. But after was also real. After was Eleanor Whitmore with a room of her own and money in a tin and a school full of children who were learning their arithmetic, and a town finding its way back to something it had lost, and a man who came to the back door on a Sunday with his hat in his hands and said the thing he had been not saying. After was Dusthaven Ridge learning that one person willing to look directly at a thing, when everything and everyone else had learned to look away, could change the temperature of a whole town. Not because one person is enough, one person is almost never enough, but because one person is sometimes the match, and a match is a small thing until the moment it isn't. Eleanor had not saved this town. The town had saved itself once it remembered it could. She had just arrived at the right moment and refused to look away. And it had turned out that was enough to remind people that they had that option too. She finished her coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the November garden was bare and frost-edged, and the mountains were white at their peaks, and the sky over Dusthaven Ridge was the particular hard blue of high country winter, clear and cold and going on forever. She put on her coat and picked up her sewing basket and went to work.